In the spring of 1974, a loan officer at First National Bank of Crane County, Texas, sat down with a stack of farm debt files and a federal agricultural survey form. His job was routine: go through the active farming operations in the county, record outstanding balances, flag delinquencies. The survey was part of a broader USDA review of dryland farm viability in the Permian Basin. Bureaucratic paperwork, the kind that gets filed and forgotten. He worked through the stack methodically: 43 farms, 44, 45. Then he stopped. He pulled one file out, looked at it, and set it face up on his desk. Then he went through the remaining files to the end, came back to it, and read it again. In 21 years of records, from 1953 through 1974, this operation had never carried a financed balance. No equipment loans, no operating lines of credit, no land mortgages. Property taxes paid on time every year without exception. The acreage had grown from 180 acres to 420 acres over 2 decades, and not $1 of that expansion had been borrowed. He called his supervisor over to look at it because he thought he might have made a data entry error. He hadn't. The operation was 420 acres of dry land, wheat, and cotton in Crane County, Texas. Free and clear, no debt. Never had been. The name on the file was Dorothy Callahan. Now let me take you back to the spring of 1953. Because 21 years before that loan officer pulled Dorothy's file from the stack, a man named Earl Whitmore stood behind the counter of the only John Deere dealership in Crane County, looked at a 22-year-old woman who'd come to buy a tractor, and laughed. Not at something she said, at the idea of her. Let me tell you what happened next. Before I do, I want to tell you something about this channel. The stories I look for are the ones that never made it into the history books, not because they weren't worth telling, but because the people living them were too busy working to stop and write them down. Women like Dorothy Callahan, men like her father, families who built something real out of nothing much in places nobody was watching, without anyone's permission or applause. Those stories exist. There are hundreds of them, and I intend to find every one. If that sounds like something worth your time, subscribe right now. Every subscriber is a signal to keep digging. Because I promise you, what Dorothy did over the next 21 years is worth staying for. Now, 1953.
Ray Callahan came to Crane County, Texas in 1931 with a truck, a used single-bottom plow, and a lease on 180 acres of dry land hardpan that the previous tenant had walked away from during the worst years of the drought. He was 22 years old. He had no farming background. His father had worked in a glass factory in Fort Worth. But Ray had spent 2 years as a hired hand on a cotton operation outside La Mesa. And somewhere in those 2 years, he had developed an obsession that would quietly shape the next 30 years of his life. Water. Not in the way a man dying of thirst thinks about water, in the way an engineer thinks about a problem. West Texas dryland farming, no irrigation, no river access, nothing but what fell from the sky, was entirely a game of moisture management. The rain that fell in Crane County was never the question. How much of it you kept was the only question that mattered. And most farmers in the county were losing the majority of what fell to runoff and surface evaporation before the roots of their crops ever reached it. Ray had watched this on the La Mesa operation and couldn't stop thinking about why. The answer, he eventually came to believe, was underneath the surface. Crane County sat on a shallow layer of caliche, a dense, calcium-cemented subsoil that water couldn't penetrate. It sat 6 to 10 inches down, depending on the field, and it acted like a floor. Rain hit the topsoil, soaked down to the caliche, and then ran sideways and off, taking the topsoil's moisture with it. The farmers above it planted into the top 6 inches and prayed. Ray's idea was simple, and at the time considered a waste of effort by everyone who heard it: break the floor. He rigged a chisel attachment to his single-bottom plow and started running it deep, 8, 10, 12 inches before every planting. It cracked the caliche layer. Not removed it, just fractured it enough to let water push through instead of running off. It was brutal on equipment and took twice as long as standard tillage. His neighbors thought he was wasting time he didn't have. His wheat yields in the dry year of 1934, when most of the county averaged 7 bushels per acre,
came in at 14. Nobody asked him why. In 1934, surviving was enough. People didn't have time to study their neighbors' methods. They were too busy trying to hold on to their own land. Ray noted the results in a ledger he'd started keeping from his first season, column by column, field by field. Rainfall, tillage depth, planting date, yield, year after year. By the time Dorothy was born in 1931, the same year Ray arrived in Crane County, though he wouldn't meet her mother for another 2 years, that ledger had become something between a scientific record and a field manual. 20 years of West Texas soil behavior, written in Ray's tight, economical handwriting in a book he kept beside the seed scale in the equipment shed. Dorothy grew up with that ledger the way other children grew up with a family Bible. She watched her father consult it. She watched him add to it. She started reading it on her own at 12, sitting on the equipment shed floor, working through the columns the way another child might work through a storybook. Ray didn't teach Dorothy to farm because he expected her to farm. He taught her because the knowledge was real and hard-won, and too important to exist in only one person's head. He taught her the way you'd teach someone to read, because a person who can read can figure out anything else. By the time she was 16, Dorothy could calibrate a planter to within a 1/4 inch of soil depth. By 18, she could look at a field after a rainstorm and tell you by the pattern of standing water exactly where the caliche floor was shallow and where it had already been broken. She could read the land the way her father had taught her to read the ledger, slowly, carefully, looking for what was underneath the surface. In March of 1953, Ray Callahan had a heart attack in the east field while running the chisel plow. He was 54 years old. He survived, but barely and not without cost. His left side came back weak. His grip, which had once been strong enough to hold a plow through rocky ground for 8 hours straight, could no longer reliably hold a steering wheel. He could still walk the fields. He could still read the soil. He could supervise, advise, and diagnose. What he could not do was operate equipment. And the farm's one working tractor, a 1941 farmall H, that had been running on determination and Ray's mechanical attention for 12 years, had finally given up its transmission the previous November. It was sitting in the equipment shed, disassembled, waiting for a rebuild that Ray no longer had the hands to complete. The farm needed a tractor. Without one, the spring planting didn't happen. Without the spring planting, there was no fall harvest. Without a fall harvest, there was no farm. Dorothy was 22 years old. She was the only one left to go buy it. The only dealer within 40 miles was Whitmore's John Deere in Crane. She drove in on a Tuesday morning in April, parked on Main Street, and walked through the front door. Whitmore's John Deere had been on Main Street in Crane since 1945. Earl Whitmore had opened it the year the war ended with a small business administration loan, a John Deere franchise agreement, and a conviction, correct as it turned out, that West Texas was about to enter an agricultural expansion that would need equipment. He'd been right. In 8 years, he'd built the dealership into the dominant operation in Crane County. He knew every farmer in the district by first name, knew their acreage, knew their credit history, knew which ones were careful and which ones were optimists. He had opinions about all of them, and his opinions were usually right. He was 49 years old when Dorothy Callahan walked through his door. Tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He was behind the parts counter when she came in, working through an invoice with his parts manager, a younger man named Dale who had been with him since 1948. There were 2 other men in the showroom, farmers, both of them, looking at a new Model 40 on the floor. Earl looked up. He didn't recognize her immediately. Dorothy had her father's dark coloring and her mother's height, and she was wearing work clothes, not anything that placed her socially. She introduced herself, Ray Callahan's daughter. His expression didn't shift toward contempt. That's important to understand. It shifted toward a kind of patient, preemptive management, the look of a man who has already decided what category something belongs in and is arranging his face accordingly. He came around the counter, asked after her father, said he was sorry to hear about the heart attack, that Ray was a good man and a dependable customer, that he hoped the recovery was going well. Dorothy thanked him and told him what she needed: a used tractor, 2 plow capacity minimum, operational for spring planting. What did he have available? Earl clasped his hands together in front of him, a gesture she would remember for the rest of her life, the gesture of a man about to explain something obvious to someone who didn't know better. He had a 1949 John Deere Model A in the back, he said. Good machine, recently serviced, $1,400. He could put together a financing package, 10% down, standard installment terms. She'd be up and running before the end of the week. Dorothy asked what the interest rate was on the installment terms. 9% annually, he said, over 4 years. She did the math in her head while he was still talking. At 9% over 4 years on $1,260 financed, she'd pay back close to $1,600 for a $1,400 tractor. In a county where a good dryland wheat year returned maybe $2,800 on 180 acres, that was a debt payment she could afford exactly as long as nothing went wrong. She said she preferred to discuss a cash price. The expression changed then, not to cruelty, to amusement, and that was worse, because amusement meant he wasn't taking her seriously enough to be unkind. He told her gently, as if redirecting a child who had asked a reasonable but impractical question, that a girl her age managing her father's recovery and running a farm alone probably had more pressing things to spend cash on than tractors, that the installment terms were there precisely for situations like hers, that the smart play, honestly, was to let one of the neighboring operations take over the Callahan acreage on a lease arrangement while her father healed. Harold Briggs over on the south end had been looking to expand, and Ray's ground was good ground, and a lease income would give her breathing room without the risk. Dorothy said she wasn't interested in leasing the land. Earl nodded like she'd confirmed something he already knew. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, and then he said it, not loudly, not cruelly, in the conversational tone of a man stating what he believed was plain fact. "Little girl, I've been selling equipment in this county since before you were driving. I know what a one-woman operation looks like, and I know what it doesn't. You go on home, talk to your daddy, and tell him Earl Whitmore said the financing terms are the most reasonable he'll find between here and Odessa." One of the men near the Model 40 looked over. Dale, behind the parts counter, found something to reorganize. Dorothy looked at Earl Whitmore for a moment. She looked at the Model A price tag. She looked at the two farmers who had looked away. Then she said, "Thank you for your time." And she walked out. Earl watched her go. He said something to Dale after the door closed. She didn't hear it, but she saw Dale's expression from the window as she passed. Whatever it wasn't kind. She drove home. She didn't tell her father what Earl had said. She told him the prices were too high and she needed a few days to look around. That night, she sat down at the kitchen table with her father's ledger and a sheet of paper, and she started doing a different kind of math. The paper she pulled out that night wasn't a diary entry. It wasn't a letter. It was a column of numbers. She wrote down every cost the farm would carry over the next 12 months. Seed, fuel, property tax, basic repairs. She wrote down the realistic yield on 180 acres in an average year and the realistic price per bushel at the crane elevator. She wrote down what the farm returned in a bad year because Ray had taught her that you plan for bad years and treat good years as a bonus, never the other way around. Then she wrote down Earl Whitmore's financing terms, the monthly payment, the total repayment over 4 years, the difference between what she'd borrow and what she'd pay back, $200 gone to interest alone, in a year when $200 was the difference between planting and not planting. She looked at the column for a long time. Then she drew a line through Earl Whitmore's numbers entirely, not because she was angry, because the math didn't work. And a decision that doesn't survive its own math isn't a decision, it's a wish. Ray had taught her that too, not in so many words, but in 20 years of watching him refuse to borrow against a harvest that hadn't happened yet. She wrote 2 words at the bottom of the page: find another. She folded the paper, put it in the back cover of her father's ledger, and went to bed. She never told Ray what Earl Whitmore said to her, not that week, not that year, not ever. As far as Ray Callahan knew, his daughter had simply done the numbers, found the financing terms unsatisfactory, and gone looking for a better option. That was accurate, it just wasn't the whole truth. Dorothy was 22 years old. She had $480 in a savings account at the same bank that held Earl Whitmore's business loan. She had 3 weeks before the planting window closed. She got to work. She spent the first weekend driving. Not aimlessly, she had a list. Every farm auction within a 4-county radius that had been posted in the Crane County Enterprise over the previous 6 months. She'd been reading the auction notices the way most people read the weather reports, out of habit and because the information was there. She hadn't known why it mattered until now. The first auction she attended was an estate sale outside Andrews, 40 miles northeast. An older cotton farmer, no heirs, equipment being liquidated by the county. She got there early, walked the equipment line before the bidding started, and looked at everything her father had taught her to look at soil. Not at the surface condition, but at what the surface condition was telling her about what was underneath. There was a 1947 Farmall M sitting at the end of the line that nobody was crowding around. Faded red, one rear tire badly worn, hydraulic lines cracked and weeping fluid. It looked, to most of the men working the auction that morning, like exactly what it was, an old tractor showing its age. Dorothy crawled underneath it, checked the crankshaft end play, ran her hand along the block looking for cracks, pulled the dipstick and looked at the oil color, checked the transmission input shaft for play. The engine was sound, the hydraulic lines were a parts counterfix, the tire was expensive but straightforward. The tractor's problem was entirely cosmetic and one mechanical failure that scared off buyers who didn't know the difference between a sick engine and a worn seal. Dorothy knew the difference. Ray had taught her the difference. She bid $290. A man in a better hat bid $310. She bid $325. He shook his head and let it go. She paid $325 for a tractor that needed $60 in hydraulic line and a rear tire she sourced from a salvage yard in Odessa for $38, not from Whitmore's, from Odessa. She had the Farmall M running in 11 days, working evenings in her father's equipment shed after the day's fieldwork was done. Ray sat in a chair by the shed door and talked her through two of the steps he knew she already knew because it was the only way he had left to help. She let him. She made the spring planting with 4 days to spare. But the equipment was only half of it. The other half was underground. When Dorothy took over the operation fully that spring, she went back to her father's ledger and read it the way she hadn't read it since she was a teenager. Not casually, but systematically, field by field, looking for the pattern. What she found was a 22-year record of exactly what happened to each section of the Callahan farm under different tillage depths, different planting schedules, and different rainfall conditions. The pattern was clear once you were looking for it. The fields where Ray had run the chisel plow deepest, 12 inches, cracking the caliche floor, consistently outperformed the fields where he'd gone shallow, and the margin widened dramatically in dry years. In wet years, the difference was modest. In dry years, it was the difference between a harvest and a loss. Dorothy standardized the deep tillage across every field, all 180 acres, every season before every planting. It cost her extra fuel and extra time, and it was brutal on the tractor. She didn't care. The ledger said it worked, and the ledger had 22 years of West Texas soil behind it. Her neighbors noticed the chisel work. Most of them had seen Ray do it for years and written it off as stubbornness. Seeing Dorothy continue it confirmed their existing opinion, that the Callahans were people who did things the hard way out of habit rather than sense. One of them mentioned it to Earl Whitmore at the hardware store. Earl drove out to the Callahan place in October of that first year, ostensibly to ask whether Dorothy needed any parts or service work going into the winter. She met him at the gate. She didn't open it. He told her his parts department could handle anything the farmall needed. Competitive pricing, no need to drive all the way to Odessa. Dorothy rested one hand on the gate post. I appreciate that. I've got what I need for now. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. He nodded, looked past her at the equipment shed for a moment, looked at the fields. You get that M running yourself? Yes, sir. He nodded again, slower this time. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite what he'd walked in with. He touched the brim of his hat and drove back down the county road. Dorothy latched the gate and went to work. She didn't know it then, but that would become the shape of their relationship for the next 20 years. Earl showing up. Dorothy meeting him at the gate never opening. The spring planting went in on time. Dorothy ran the chisel plow first, 12 inches deep across every field, the same depth Ray had documented as optimal in the ledger's 1947 and 1948 entries, and then ran the Farmall M behind it to work the broken soil into a seedbed. It took 11 days. It was brutal on fuel and harder on the equipment than standard tillage, and Calvin, who was helping part-time that first season, asked her twice whether it was really necessary to go that deep. She showed him the relevant pages of the ledger both times. He didn't ask a third time. The wheat went in during the second week of May. Dorothy planted cotton on the 20 acres Ray's ledger had identified as having the best drainage profile. A south-facing section with a natural grade that moved standing water off the surface without carrying topsoil with it. The rest went to wheat. Then June arrived. The rain stopped in the first week of June and didn't come back until September. Not a drought in the catastrophic sense, dew dust, no total failures, but a sustained, pressing dryness that tightened across the county through July and August like a hand closing slowly. The kind of summer that didn't announce itself as a crisis until you were already inside one. By August, the county's wheat was struggling visibly. Fields that had looked adequate in May were thin and pale by midsummer, their root systems reaching for moisture that had evaporated off the surface weeks earlier. The county extension office would later calculate the 1954 average at 8 bushels per acre, the worst yield since the dry years of the late 1940s. Dorothy's wheat came in at 19 bushels per acre. The caliche floor, fractured across all 180 acres by the spring tillage, had allowed the early spring rainfall to penetrate to a depth where the summer heat couldn't reach it. While the county's surface-planted fields dried from the top down, Dorothy's wheat roots were pulling moisture from 8 and 10 inches below the surface, moisture that had nowhere to go because the broken caliche beneath it had been holding it there since March. Ray had documented this exact behavior in the ledger across 3 separate drought years. Dorothy had read those entries enough times to know them by sequence. She had not been surprised by the result, but seeing it play out at scale across 180 acres in a summer that was taking her neighbors apart field by field was different from reading about it. She filed the yield records that fall with her hands steady and her face quiet, the way her father had always filed his. The neighbors noticed, not with admiration, not yet, with the particular confusion of people who have watched someone do something that shouldn't work and watched it work and cannot yet bring themselves to ask why. 3 of them mentioned it to Earl Whitmore at the hardware store in September. Earl drove out to the Callahan place the following week. Same approach as always, a pretext about parts availability, a slow look at the equipment, a slower look at the fields. Dorothy met him at the gate. He asked how the season had gone. Fine. Better than most. He looked at the fields for a moment, looked back at her. That deep tillage your daddy used to do. Yes, sir. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is filing something away rather than responding to it. Then he touched his hat brim and drove back down the county road. Dorothy latched the gate. She'd cleared $1,100 after taxes, seed reserves, and Calvin's wages. In the worst yield year the county had seen in nearly a decade, on 180 acres of dry land hardpan, with a repaired tractor she'd bought at auction and a farming method her neighbors considered eccentric at best. $1,100. It was not enough to feel safe, she knew that with complete clarity, but it was enough to prove the ledger right. And the ledger being right was the only thing that mattered. The harvest was done by mid-October. The fields were empty. The equipment was winterized and sitting in the shed. The ledger was updated, yields recorded, soil notes added, next year's tillage plan sketched in the margin the way Ray had always done it. There was nothing left to do, and that was the problem. Because when there was nothing left to do, there was nothing left to stop Dorothy from sitting at the kitchen table after her father went to sleep and running the numbers she'd been too busy to run since April. She did it on a Thursday night in November of 1954, with the wind coming off the Permian Basin the way it does in late fall, low and steady and indifferent. The kind of wind that doesn't gust, it just presses. She had the ledger open, her harvest receipts in a stack, and a cup of coffee that went cold while she was working. The farm had survived, more than survived. She'd outproduced most of her neighbors in the driest years since the war. She had $1,100 in the bank after taxes and seed reserves. By any objective measure, the year was a success. But $1,100 was not a margin, it was a ledge. One equipment failure she couldn't fix, one hailstorm in June, which happened in Crane County on average once every 4 years, one season where the caliche ran shallow across the east section and the chisel plow threw a shear bolt at the wrong moment and she lost a week of tillage time she couldn't recover. Any one of those things and the $1,100 was gone. The year after it was gone, the farm was gone. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about Earl Whitmore's suggestion, not the way he delivered it, but the actual content of it. Lease the land to Harold Briggs, take the income, get a job in town, stop carrying something this heavy alone. It wasn't a stupid suggestion. That was the part she couldn't dismiss. Stripped of the condescension it had arrived with, it was a reasonable response to her actual situation. And sitting at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a November night with the wind pressing against the windows and $1,100 between her and losing her father's farm, she couldn't pretend otherwise. She got up, poured the cold coffee out, stood at the kitchen window and looked at the east field, which was nothing in the dark except the idea of a field. Her father had broken that ground in 1931 with a borrowed plow and a lease agreement and no experience whatsoever. He had run that chisel plow across it for 22 years. He had written down everything it told him, season by season, until the ledger that was sitting open on the kitchen table behind her contained more knowledge about those 180 acres than any other document in existence. She thought about what it would mean to hand that to Harold Briggs, who she was fairly certain had never heard of a caliche floor, and would compact the east section back to hardpan inside of 3 seasons. She went back to the table, closed the ledger, went to bed. She never told anyone about that night for 30 years, not her father, not the one close friend she had in Crane. Nobody. When a reporter from the Crane County Enterprise interviewed her in 1983, she mentioned it almost in passing, and what she said was this: "I came close. I won't tell you I didn't. But I kept thinking about my father's east field and what Harold Briggs would do to it, and I couldn't make the numbers on that feel better than the numbers on staying. So I stayed. That's it. No revelation, no dramatic moment of clarity. Just a woman at a kitchen table in the dark doing math until the answer she could live with outweighed the answer that was easier. She planted in April." I want to stop here for a moment and ask you something. Not about farming. Not about tractors or caliche or dryland yields. Have you ever sat alone with a decision that was completely yours to make? No one to consult, no one to share the weight of it. And the reasonable option and the right option were pointing in completely different directions, where the thing that made sense on paper was not the thing you could live with. That's where Dorothy was in November of 1954. She wasn't stubborn. She wasn't fearless. She was a 23-year-old woman doing arithmetic at a kitchen table in the dark, trying to find a number that let her keep her father's work in the world. Drop a comment and tell me what your version of that kitchen table looked like. What was the decision? What did you choose? Because what Dorothy does over the next 18 years is going to land differently if you've been there. Let me tell you about the next 14 years, because this is where most people would have leveled off. Not failed, leveled off, settled into survival, which is its own kind of surrender. The kind that doesn't look like giving up because the lights are still on and the fields are still planted, but nothing is growing except the calendar. Dorothy didn't level off. 1956. She'd been watching the parcels around her the way her father had watched his soil, quietly, consistently, without announcing it. 3 years of bookkeeping at the Crane grain elevator had given her a view of the county's agricultural finances that most farmers would have paid for and didn't know existed. She knew which operations were carrying too much debt relative to their yield averages. She knew which ones were one bad season from a decision they didn't want to make. In the spring of 1956, a cotton farmer named Pete Albright told his wife he was done. He was 61 years old, his knees were gone, his son had taken a job in Midland and wasn't coming back. He wanted to move to his sister's place in Lubbock before he got any older. He had 40 acres on the north end of the county that adjoined the Callahan farm's western boundary. Decent ground, though Pete had never deep-tilled it and the caliche floor was intact. He listed it at $18 an acre. Dorothy offered $70 an acre, $2,800 cash, and Pete took it before she finished the sentence. Her neighbors thought she overpaid. They were looking at the surface. Dorothy was looking at what 40 acres of untouched caliche floor directly adjacent to her existing operation would return once the chisel plow had been through it for 2 seasons. She was right. They weren't. 220 acres now, all of it free and clear. 1958, she hired Calvin Reese, a 17-year-old from town whose father had worked on a neighboring operation before a back injury ended his farming days. Calvin was a quick learner and, more importantly, a careful one. He was the kind of young man who watched before he acted, which was the only kind Dorothy had any use for. She paid him $1.40 an hour when the going rate in the county was $1.05. When her neighbor Jean Hafner asked her why she was paying above rate for a teenager with no experience, she told him that underpaid workers cut corners, and corners in dryland farming were where you lost your moisture retention. Gene thought that was an odd way to think about labor costs. He was also losing roughly 15% more topsoil per season than Dorothy was, so his opinion on the matter wasn't one she weighted heavily. 1960. The second major drought of Dorothy's farming life arrived in June and stayed through September. The county's wheat average that year was 8 bushels per acre. 3 operations filed for emergency operating loans through the Farmers' Home Administration. One didn't make it to the following spring. Dorothy's deep-tilled fields came in at 17 bushels per acre, more than double the county average, for the same reason they had outperformed in 1954. The caliche floor had been fractured across every inch of her acreage. When the rain fell, it went down instead of running off. When the surface dried out, there was moisture at depth that her wheat roots could still reach. She filed the yield records in her own ledger, which by 1960 had grown to a second volume alongside her father's original. Earl Whitmore had a difficult year in 1960. 3 of his financed customers were behind on their installment payments. His parts revenue was flat. He'd hired a second salesman in 1958 on the assumption that the late 50s agricultural expansion would continue, and by 1960 he was carrying a payroll he couldn't fully justify. He came out to the Callahan place in October, same as he did most years. Same gate, same brief exchange. This time he asked about the yields. He'd heard the number, 17 bushels, from someone at the elevator. He wanted to know if it was accurate. Dorothy told him it was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what she was doing differently. "Same thing my father did," she said. "I'm just doing it on more ground." He nodded. He didn't ask what that meant. She didn't elaborate. 1963. Ray Callahan died on a Tuesday morning in January, in his own bed at age 54. He had been declining slowly since a third cardiac episode the previous spring, and the end, when it came, was quiet. Dorothy found his ledger on the kitchen table the morning after the funeral, opened the last entry he'd made, dated 3 days before he died, in handwriting that was shakier than she'd ever seen it, but still precise in its columns. He had recorded the soil condition of the east section after the fall tillage, moisture retention estimate, tillage depth, organic matter observation, the same categories he'd been recording since 1931. At the bottom of the entry, below the columns, he had written 4 words that weren't part of the standard record. "Don't let them mine it." Dorothy closed the ledger. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she put the ledger on the shelf beside her own second volume, and the next morning she went out and fed the equipment and checked the east field's soil moisture and wrote it down in her own book. That was how she buried her father, by continuing the record. 1964 to 1966. She rotated cotton into the operation for the first time on the fields Ray's ledger had identified as having the drainage characteristics to support it. Cotton returned more per acre than wheat in a good year, but was more volatile. A late frost or a June hailstorm could take the whole crop. Dorothy used the cotton years the way a careful person uses a bonus. She didn't plan around them, she saved them. The good cotton years went directly into a separate account she didn't touch. She called it the contingency fund. By the end of 1966, it held $8,400. She called it that in the ledger. In her own head, she called it the insurance against everyone who thinks I won't make it. 1967. Bob Mercer, who farmed 80 acres on Dorothy's eastern boundary, had been carrying an implement loan through a Midland finance company since 1963. The loan had been structured with a balloon payment at the 4-year mark. Bob had assumed in 1963 that 4 years was enough time to make the numbers work. It wasn't. Dorothy heard about the situation at the elevator in February. By March, Bob was negotiating with the finance company on a short sale. Dorothy called him before he called anyone else. She paid $14,000 cash, $175 an acre for 80 acres of ground that the finance company would have taken at $140. She paid the extra $35 an acre because Bob Mercer had never done her any harm, and because her father believed that the way you bought land from a neighbor in trouble said something permanent about who you were. 300 acres, debt-free. Dorothy was 36 years old. 1968. Earl Whitmore sold his second new tractor that calendar year. His first had been in March, to a large operation outside the county that was consolidating acreage and needed the capacity.
The second was to a younger farmer who had recently inherited land and had more optimism than history. 2 new tractors in a full calendar year for the only John Deere dealer in Crane County. Dorothy noted this the way she noted everything, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, just as information, filed in the part of her mind that was always watching, always adding columns, always reading what the numbers were actually saying underneath what they've appeared to say. The surface was fine. The caliche floor was cracking.
If you're still with me 18 years into Dorothy Callahan's story, you already know this isn't a story about farming. It's a story about what happens when someone refuses to let other people's ceilings become their floors. There are more stories like this one, dozens of them, buried in county records and old elevator ledgers and farm auction receipts that nobody has looked at in 50 years. Subscribe so you're there when I find the next one. Now, 1969. Let me tell you about what was building underneath the surface of Crane County's agricultural economy between 1969 and 1973, because most of the farmers living through it didn't see it coming until it had already arrived. The late 1960s were good years for West Texas agriculture. Commodity prices were strong, the equipment manufacturers were pushing new lines, bigger tractors, wider implements, more horsepower than most dryland operations in Crane County had ever had access to. The pitch from dealers like Earl Whitmore was consistent and in good years persuasive. More acreage, more yield, more return. The way to grow was to spend, and the way to spend was to borrow, and the way to borrow was to walk into Whitmore's John Deere and sign the financing paperwork that Earl's new office manager had gotten very efficient at processing. Between 1967 and 1971, Earl financed 11 equipment packages to Crane County farmers through his own dealership credit line, not through a bank, through Whitmore's directly, acting as the lender, collecting the installment payments himself, and carrying the risk on his own books. It looked like a smart business decision in 1967. It looked like a different thing entirely by 1973. The first signal came in the spring of 1972, a wet March followed by a cold April that pushed planting schedules back 3 weeks across the county. 3 weeks late in dryland cotton is not a delay. It is a different crop, and usually a worse one. Yields that fall came in 20% below projections for most operations. Tight margins got tighter. Then, October of 1973 arrived. The OPEC oil embargo didn't announce itself to West Texas farmers as a geopolitical event. It announced itself as a diesel price that doubled in 6 weeks and a fertilizer cost that followed it upward because anhydrous ammonia production runs on natural gas, and natural gas prices were moving in the same direction as everything else. An operation that had budgeted $4,200 for fuel and fertilizer in the spring of 1973 was looking at $7,800 for the same inputs by fall. That difference, $3,600, was, for a mid-sized dryland operation in Crane County, the entire margin between a profitable year and a year that required a bridge loan to survive. Most of Earl's financed customers didn't have a bridge loan. They had Earl, and Earl, by the fall of 1973, was carrying $190,000 in outstanding customer installment debt on his dealership's credit line, against a parts and service revenue that had been flat for 2 years and a new equipment sales figure that his own records showed declining annually since 1969. He had built his financing model on the assumption that commodity prices would stay strong and his customers would stay solvent. The assumption had seemed reasonable for long enough that he'd stopped questioning it. In November of 1973, 2 of his installment customers missed their payments entirely. 3 more called to ask about deferrals. Earl spent that month on the telephone more than he'd spent in the previous 3 years combined, calling his own creditors, calling the John Deere regional office, calling a banker in Midland he'd known since the 1950s, who told him, with the directness of an old friend, that the numbers he was describing were not a cash flow problem, they were a structural problem. And structural problems didn't resolve themselves with time, they resolved themselves with decisions, and the decisions available to Earl at this point were all painful. He closed the showroom floor for 3 days in December to take inventory, stood in the middle of a room that had once held 6 tractors and now held 2, both on consignment from customers who couldn't afford to keep them, and looked at what 28 years of building something had come to. He was 69 years old. He locked up on the 3rd day and drove home and didn't tell his wife what he'd seen when he counted the numbers. She found out 6 weeks later when the John Deere regional representative came to discuss the franchise terms. Dorothy filed her 1973 harvest records in her ledger that same December. 300 acres, 0 debt, yield above county average for the 19th consecutive season. She noted the diesel price increase in the margin beside the fuel cost column and adjusted her 1974 operating budget accordingly. Then she turned the page and started spring.
Dorothy's 1973 wheat harvest came in at 21 bushels per acre. Not her best year. Her best year had been 1971 at 26 bushels. But the county average in 1973, a year of compressed planting schedules, spiking input costs, and a June dry-off that caught most operations short, was 9 bushels per acre. She was running more than double the county average in the worst agricultural year the region had seen since the early 1950s. The caliche floor, fractured across every inch of her 300 acres by 20 consecutive seasons of deep tillage, had held the spring moisture at depth while the county's surface-planted fields baked from the top down. The ledger had been right. It had been right in 1954 and 1960 and 1967, and it was right again in 1973. It was right every time because it wasn't a prediction, it was a record. And the record said that water held in deep soil doesn't evaporate on schedule just because the surface looks dry. She ran the numbers that fall and found what she'd expected to find. After fuel costs at the new prices, after seed and tax and Calvin Reese's wages, which she raised to $3.10 an hour in 1971, well above the county rate, and had no intention of cutting. She had cleared $6,400 on the year. Not a windfall, a foundation. She pulled out the contingency account ledger, the account she'd built from the good cotton years in 1964 and 1965, and hadn't touched since. It held $8,400. Combined with the year's net, she had $14,800 in liquid reserves, no debt, no deferred payments, no outstanding obligations of any kind. She went to 2 farm auctions in the spring of 1974. The first was for 60 acres on the county's northwest boundary, a cotton operation whose owner had been carrying an equipment loan through Whitmore's since 1969 and couldn't service it after the input cost spike. The bank had the note. Dorothy paid $11,200 cash, $186 an acre for ground she knew from the elevator records had never been deep-tilled and was, therefore, not producing anything close to what it could. The second was 40 acres from an estate sale, a retired farmer whose son had no interest in the land and wanted it gone quickly. Dorothy paid $3,400, $85 an acre. Fair price. The son shook her hand and thanked her for not making it complicated. 360 acres, then 400. By June of 1974, with one private purchase from a neighbor who decided to move his family to Odessa, Dorothy Callahan owned 420 acres of Crane County, Texas. Every acre free and clear. She was 43 years old. She had started with 180 acres, a repaired tractor, and $325 she'd spent at an auction while Earl Whitmore was back in Crane telling farmers the only path forward was his financing terms. She had never once taken those terms. She had never once needed to. And now, sitting on 420 acres of the deepest tilled, best moisture-retaining dryland ground in the county, in the middle of the worst agricultural crisis the region had seen in a generation, Dorothy Callahan was not in trouble. She was in position. Whitmore's John Deere closed on a Friday morning in March of 1975. Not dramatically, not with an announcement or a public statement. Earl simply didn't open the showroom that morning, and by the following Monday, the John Deere regional franchise sign had been removed from the building's facade,
leaving a rectangle of cleaner paint where it had hung for 30 years. The John Deere regional office had pulled the franchise license in February, citing the unrecoverable customer debt load and Earl's inability to meet his own floor plan financing obligations. Earl had fought it for 4 months before accepting that there was nothing left to fight with. He was 70 years old. He had $40,000 in personal savings, a paid-off house, and a dealership building that was worth more empty than it was worth operating for the past 2 years. He signed the paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. His son, David, drove him home. 3 weeks later, David Whitmore turned into the Callahan farm's driveway on a Wednesday evening in April. Dorothy was in the equipment shed replacing a fuel injector on the farm hall when she heard the truck. She came out wiping her hands on a shop rag. She recognized the Whitmore family's truck before she recognized David, who was 35 now and had his father's broad build, but not his father's easy confidence. He was standing beside the truck with his hands in his jacket pockets when Dorothy crossed the yard. She knew why he was there before he said a word. He introduced himself, said his father had asked him to come, said Earl had been thinking about something for a long time and wasn't able to come himself, not because he was ill, but because he was proud, and proud men found certain drives difficult to make. Dorothy said she understood that. David looked at the gate between them for a moment, then looked up. He said his father wanted her to know that he remembered the morning in 1953 that she'd walked into the dealership, that he'd thought about it more times than he could count over the past 25 years, and that what he'd said to her, the way he'd said it, in front of customers in his own showroom, had been wrong, not just impolite, wrong in the way that matters, the kind that doesn't diminish with time. He said his father had watched her build what she'd built, had watched the 1973 and 1974 seasons expose exactly whose approach to farming had been correct, and wanted her to know that he knew, that he'd always known somewhere underneath the certainty he'd walked around in for most of his life, that he'd been wrong about her from the first moment. Earl wasn't asking for anything, he just needed her to know that he knew. Dorothy listened to all of it without interrupting, then she asked how Earl was doing. David said he was okay, adjusting. He'd started fishing, which he never had time for when the dealership was running. Dorothy almost smiled at that. She said, "Tell your father I appreciate him sending you. That wasn't a small thing to do for either of you." She paused. "And tell him the advice he gave me in 1953 about leasing the land, letting someone else carry it. I've thought about it too. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He told me what he believed to be true. The problem was never his intentions. It was what he assumed before I walked through the door." David nodded. He didn't argue with any of it. "One more thing," Dorothy said. "Tell him the farm hall M I bought at the Andrews auction in 1953 is still running. I thought he might want to know that." David looked at the equipment shed. He looked back at Dorothy. He shook her hand. He got in the truck and drove back down the county road. Dorothy stood in the yard and watched the dust settle after her taillights disappeared. She felt nothing that resembled triumph. What she felt was closer to tiredness, not the tiredness of effort, but the tiredness that comes after something that needed to happen has finally happened, and you realize how long you were carrying the weight of it not having happened yet. She went back inside, finished the fuel injector, washed her hands at the shed sink, then she walked across the yard to the east field, her father's east field, the one he'd broken in 1931, the one he'd run the chisel plow across for 22 years, the one she'd been running it across for another 22, and stood at the edge of it in the April dark. The soil was ready for spring. It was always ready for spring.
Let me tell you about what Dorothy built after that, because the acreage was never the real point. It was the evidence, the proof of concept, the things she could point to when she needed credibility she hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. What she actually spent the last 13 years of her farming life building was something that didn't show up in county records or bank files or agricultural surveys. It showed up in other people's fields. Starting in 1968, before the crisis, before the payoff, while she was still in the middle of the long build, Dorothy had begun doing something she never announced and never named. When she heard, through the elevator or through the county's small circuit of word and rumor, that a young farm family was struggling with yields they couldn't explain or debt they couldn't service, she drove out. Not to advise, not to lecture, to look. She would walk the fields the way her father had walked his own, slowly, stopping, kneeling down to dig up a handful of soil, checking the depth of the topsoil, looking for the surface signs of an intact caliche floor underneath. She would ask questions about tillage depth and planting schedule and input costs. She would listen to the answers without interrupting. Then she would tell them what she saw, specifically in columns the way Ray had taught her to think. This field, this depth, this problem, this fix. She never stayed longer than the work required. She never charged anything. She never mentioned her own operation unless someone asked directly. Between 1968 and 1981, she walked the fields of 11 different farm families in Crane County and 2 in adjacent Upton County. She brought her father's ledger on 3 of those visits, not to show off, but because certain soil behaviors were easier to explain with 20 years of documented evidence behind them than with words alone. 6 of those families were still farming in 1985. In a county that lost nearly a third of its agricultural operations between 1973 and 1982, 6 out of 11 was not a small number. She also did something quieter. Calvin Reese, who had worked for Dorothy since 1958 and was, by the mid-1970s, as knowledgeable about dryland caliche floor farming as anyone in the county, wanted his own land. He'd been saving since his first season. By 1976, he had enough for a down payment, but not enough to avoid financing. Dorothy leased him 40 acres of her north section at below market rate, payable after harvest, nothing owed in a failed season, and lent him the equipment to work it. She told him 2 things when they shook hands on the arrangement. The lease terms were what she wished someone had offered her in 1953, and if he ever deep-tilled less than 10 inches, she would know before he did. Calvin farmed those 40 acres for 4 years. In 1980, he bought them outright at the appraised value, no discount, Dorothy wouldn't hear of it, and added 60 acres of his own the following spring. He still farms in Crane County today. His daughter is studying agricultural science at Texas Tech. When Dorothy retired from active farming in 1988 at age 57, she leased the full 420 acres to a young couple from a farm family in Midland who had the knowledge and the work ethic and no land of their own. Fair rent, first right to buy, same terms Calvin had gotten, because those were the only terms Dorothy knew how to offer. She gave them 2 things along with the lease agreement. The first was a tour of every field, every quadrant, every section, 22 years of her own observations and 32 years of her father's before that, delivered on foot over 2 full days in April. The second was the ledger, both volumes, 54 years of Crane County soil behavior in 2 books, in 2 different handwritings, covering every field on the property in more detail than any university extension study had ever produced. She told them, "The knowledge in those books is worth more than everything sitting in the equipment shed. Don't lose it, and don't stop adding to it." They didn't. The 3rd volume is theirs now. In the spring of 1983, a reporter from the Crane County Enterprise drove out to the Callahan farm to write a profile on Dorothy for the paper's annual agricultural edition. He asked her the questions reporters ask: how many acres, how long, what was the secret? Dorothy answered the first 2 and was quiet for a moment on the 3rd. Then she said this: "People want the secret to be something complicated, a technique nobody else knows, some special knowledge. But my father figured out the secret in 1931, and it fits on 1 line. Put more in than you take out every single year and don't stop. That's true of soil, it's true of money, it's true of people. I've never found anything it wasn't true of." The reporter asked about Earl Whitmore, about 1953, about what it meant to have outlasted the man who dismissed her. Dorothy looked at him, he later wrote, the way a person looks at a question that doesn't quite understand what it's asking. She said, "I didn't outlast Earl Whitmore. I just didn't build the way he built. He built on what other people owed him. I built on what the ground could hold. When the hard years came, one of those things turned out to be reliable, and one of them didn't. That's not a competition. That's just how it works." She stood up. The interview was over. The reporter sat in his truck for a few minutes before he started the engine, trying to decide which of the 2 quotes to use. He used both.
Right now, somewhere, someone is being sized up the moment they walk through a door. Not evaluated, sized up. The kind of assessment that happens in the first 3 seconds before a word has been spoken, based entirely on what someone looks like and what category that puts them in. Too young, too old, wrong background, wrong name, wrong face for the room they just walked into. And somewhere in that room there is a man like Earl Whitmore, not a villain, not a monster, just a person so certain of his own experience that he has stopped being able to learn from anyone who doesn't look like his existing customers. A person who has confused the limits of his own imagination with the limits of what's possible. He's going to say something, maybe out loud, in front of people, maybe just in the arrangement of his face, the way he reaches past someone to help the person behind them, the way the door stays closed without anyone having to lock it. And the person it happens to is going to drive home. They're going to sit at a kitchen table. They're going to run the numbers until the numbers say something they can live with. That moment, the kitchen table, the column of figures, the decision nobody else will ever know was made, that is where everything starts. Not at the door that didn't open, at the table where someone decided what to do next. Earl Whitmore didn't fail because Dorothy beat him. He failed because he built on assumptions, and assumptions are not a foundation. They are a ceiling that eventually comes down. Dorothy built on soil, specifically on the principle her father had documented across 32 years of West Texas hardpan, that the ground returns exactly what you put into it, and that depth, in tillage, in knowledge, in patience, is the only thing that holds when everything on the surface dries out. The dealer laughed and called her little girl. 20 years later, her dealership was bankrupt, her ground was the deepest tilled in the county, and the ledger her father started in 1931 was on its way to a 3rd volume, because the soil remembered everything they put into it. It always does. If this story changed how you think about what you're building and how you're building it, I need 3 things from you. First, subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Farmers, builders, and people who were told no in rooms that had no right to say it. I find them and I tell them. Subscribe so you're there for the next one. Second, drop a comment and tell me what's the one thing someone told you you couldn't do that you went and did anyway. I read every single one. Third, share this with someone who's been told to hand over what they built and let someone else handle it. The dealer said, "Go home, little girl." She went home. She farmed for 35 more years, and the ground she left behind was better than the ground she inherited. That's the whole story. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.